RSVP'd that haven't jumped on yet, as far as I can tell. Because we have a number of folks here and a number more that have RSVP'd, instead of doing sort of an introduction round, I'm just going to sort of call off the folks that I've seen jump on, and feel free to jump in and say, hey, how you doing? But I'm going to try and go through that list relatively quickly so that we have plenty of time to sort of go through the actual meat of the discussion that we're hoping to talk about today. So, and after I get done with the names that I've seen, I'm sure that there's going to be a couple of folks here that either joined on while I was speaking or that maybe I just missed in the give and take of folks signing on. And after that, we'll catch up with the folks that I did not have on that I hadn't seen yet on my list. So I have, as everyone says, I apologize in advance if I am off on your name. Please correct me so that I do better next time. Okay, going from the top to bottom here, I have Michelle Limbarger.
Yes.
Okay. This is also a great opportunity to test audio. Stephen Shepard.
Yep, hello.
Great. Jonathan Balkema.
Present.
Philip Godsey.
Here, sir.
Nathan Phillips.
I'm here. Thank you.
Ingrid Fish.
Hi. Thanks, Andy.
Brian, either Kreis or Kreis. I'm not sure. Sorry.
Brian Kreis. Here.
Kreis. Thank you. Phil Barnhart.
I'm here.
Okay. Rhett Lawrence. I don't know why I said Anderson there.
I'm here.
Alyssa Baz.
Hello, I'm here. Thanks.
Cesar Diaz.
Hi there. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm here.
Okay, so that's everybody that I caught when I was trying to catch the participants as they joined. I'm guessing there's at least a few here. So maybe just raise a hand and I can call on you. That way we're not having everybody talk at once. Okay, I got a V. Pekar.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Is it Nolani Derrickson?
Yes, Nolani Derrickson with Tesla. Hi, folks.
Hey, this is Mary Brazel with the Oregon Department of Transportation. I'm not exactly sure how to raise my hand. I always get confused with Zoom. So
that works. I got you, Mary. Thank you. Miles Pengilly.
Miles Pengilly here on behalf of Fourth.
Okay. Okay, I don't see any other raised hands. Nobody is jumping in here. Is there anybody who is planning on participating that didn't get a chance to identify themselves or that I did not call on?
I'm Matt Roselle, building code official for Clackamas.
Oh. Hey, Matt.
Hey, thanks.
Okay, I think we're good there. There was one question in the chat about how long we're expecting this to go. We have it slated to go from 1:30 to 3:30. It'll be, whether or not it goes the full distance will probably be a little dependent on the discussion that we're having. If I've done these in the past where a whole bunch of people show. Sorry?
Apologies. Okay. Jillian DeMedio with the ODOT Climate Office.
Hi, Jillian. I've done these in the past where a whole bunch of people show up, but everybody shows up just to hear what everyone else has to say. And as a result, there isn't a ton of discussion that's had. Just as easily, we could have a very wide ranging discussion, even though there's only those 3 issues to talk about. So it could go that we have it slated for the full 2 hours. Whether or not it goes that full distance, I'm not sure, but that's what we have it slated for. Answer that question. Okay. In that case, I'm going to go ahead and start kicking us off with the meat of the agenda. I'm going to do something that one of my high school teachers hated doing, which is I handed something out to you and now I'm going to read part of it to you. But nonetheless, here we go. House Bill 2180 passed the Oregon legislature during the 2021 session and was signed into law by the governor. The content of the bill was added to Oregon revised statutes at 455.417. The law requires the director of DCBS to amend state building codes to require that new construction of certain buildings, commercial, multifamily, and mixed use, include provisions for electrical service capacity for specified percentage of parking spaces. Excuse me. It allows a municipality to use a land use process to adopt a local percentage of parking space requirements that is higher than the state building code requirements. The code amendments must be effective by July 1st, 2022. During this process, we will discuss rulemaking issues. During this meeting, excuse me, we will discuss rulemaking issues related to the implementation of ORS 455.417. These issues are listed below, and this is that packet that I sent out to you all yesterday. After we get through the list, there will be an opportunity for you to address any additional issues you think the division should consider in this rulemaking. Also, if you have comments you would like to submit after this meeting, you have that classic virtual going home moment where you hang up and immediately realize what you should have said. Feel free to email them to us at rulescoordinator.bcd@dcbs.oregon.gov. No later than end of day this Friday, the 22nd. And all of that, everything that I just read is in that packet that I sent you. So if you feel the need to copy something down, it's all there. Feel free to just refer to that. In terms of structure, what I'm planning on doing, because we have so many people, is trying to, we want it to be as much of an open discussion as possible. That said, as facilitating it, I'm going to try and make sure that if there's someone that can't sort of get in edgewise on the conversation, there is the chat. There'll be multiple staff people that are sort of monitoring the chat to make sure that if something needs to come up there, you can either just say, hey, I have something I want to get in, and we'll make sure to call on you before we move to the next thing. Or if you just have a question or a comment that doesn't really need to get inserted into the discussion, but you want us to be aware of it, you can throw it in there and we'll know about it that way. In terms of timing of the discussion, I'm not intending to sort of enforce a time cutoff for any particular issue, but I do want to get to all three of them. So if we are going really long on the first issue, I might sort of have us wrap it up in short term, discuss the next two, and then come back to additional discussion on that first one, or transfer that to any particular issue that we seem to be going along on, because I do want to make sure that we have a chance to talk about all three. Really quickly, introducing the staff on the line. I realized I did not introduce myself up front. I am Andy Boulton. I'm a senior policy advisor with the Building Codes Division. We also have the indispensable person here today, which is Melissa Stiles, who is running most of the tech side of this behind the scenes and making sure this whole thing runs. And then just in case I get out of my depth with any of your questions on the technical side, we have Tony Rocco and Mark Heiser from the division on the technical team that can pick up my slack in terms of things that folks know more about than I do. Okay. Is there any questions about the process or expectations for this meeting before we kick it off? Okay, hearing none. Feel free to speak up at any time. This is not like not like an enforced parliamentary meeting. I see a hand there, Mary. I will get to you in just 1 second. This is not like an enforced parliamentary meeting where there needs to be motions or voting. This is an open discussion. It's really just us trying to solicit as many ideas and feedback from all of you that we can get. But so we don't necessarily need to come to a consensus at the end of it. We just want to hear all the viewpoints. Okay, Mary, sorry, thanks for waiting.
Yeah, I wanted just a little follow-up on the overall process. So you just explained that this is a conversation and you're just kind of hearing various comments, but then is there a follow-on revision that might be reviewed and shared with folks? Is there a comment period for that as well? Is there another version that comes out basically before it becomes finalized? And what's the timeline for that? I believe it has to be into effect by July.
Yeah, the July 1st is the effective date, which gives us a required filing date of, I want to say, May 13th. So after this meeting, we will be taking in all of the feedback that we got and looking at it, whether or not it's something that makes sort of changes our thinking about the rulemaking and whether or not we're implementing the legislation correctly. And regardless of what comes out of that session, there will also, during the normal rulemaking process, there'll be a public hearing that takes place on the rulemaking after we file on or before the 13th of May. That'll be the filing date, excuse me. The hearing will almost definitely take place in the Tuesday of the third week of June, which I can't do the math in my head to figure out what the date is, but it'll probably be sometime around. It's typically late teens is when that falls. But yeah, so that rulemaking hearing will be an additional opportunity for public comment on whatever we end up settling on the rulemaking.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Any additional process questions or sort of a before we kick off type of questions? Okay. I don't know if everybody is on video or if I'm seeing everybody that's on video. Just a heads up in case. I think I'm seeing all the videos right now. So I can see if someone's shaking their head. That said, I would not necessarily rely on the fact of me being able to see you shaking your head or nodding your head, or any sort of non-verbal communication is probably going to be somewhat suspect. And so if it looks like I'm about to pass you up when you have something to say, feel free to shout it out. Okay. With that said, let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to move right into issue 1. And this again is going to involve me reading something that I have already distributed to you to read yourself. So I'm sorry in advance if I'm rehashing it for you. Does the proposed rulemaking fulfill the requirements of the legislation? The intent of this rulemaking is to fully implement the requirements articulated in ORS 455-417. That statute requires that the building code be amended. The statute states that the amendment must require that for certain types of new construction, at least 20% of vehicle parking spaces in the garage or parking area must include electrical service capacity for charging electric vehicles. The types of new construction that would trigger this new requirement are commercial buildings under private ownership, multifamily residential buildings with 5 or fewer dwelling units, and mixed-use buildings consisting of privately owned commercial space and 5 or more dwelling units. The requirements may not be applied to townhouses. The division welcomes feedback from the committee on whether the proposed rule language that's attached to your packet towards the bottom to this adequately fulfills the requirements of ORS 455-417. And some options the committee could give feedback on are you guys did a great job building codes. The proposed rulemaking does fulfill the requirements of the legislation, or changes should be made to the proposed rules to fulfill the requirements of the legislation. And if you think changes should be made, feel free to let us know what you think we should change. Yes, John.
So I guess a couple clarification points. So reading the bill 2180, it does reference townhouses, but it specifically uses the land use definition, which differs from the building code definition of townhouses, since we decided to merge townhouse and row house together. Have you guys reached out to the LC to make sure the true intent was all townhouses, or just the land of the actual planning side of the world's townhouses, which is separated by real property lines?
I am not sure, but I'm going to see if Tony, if he knows. I know he's on here, but I'm not sure if he's.
Thanks, Andy. No, I'm not aware of us following up on that, Jonathan. That's a good question. I think the intent was kind of bifurcating ORSC governance structures. That was what I understood of it, but we can follow up on that for sure and note it.
Hey, Jonathan, your mic's not on.
I guess I should unmute myself. So then I follow up on that one, on other subject. Reading the bill also, it infers the parking area for the building is the way they specify it. We ran some analysis on some of our larger box store style areas that often provide parking in excess of what's required. Do you know the way they phrase that? Is there some flexibility in how the rule's written so it's only required parking? So that way, if they do seasonal overflow parking, we don't have to use those calculations because, like one of our decent sized department store style box stores, they're going to, if we count all of their overflow parking, it's over 100 or more EV charging stations, which may be overkill initially. You know what I mean?
I am not sure how they're going to write it into code. Again, if Tony has any insight here.
I think, again, I think we could note that. I would assume it would just be the required parking. The overlap here that's difficult, as you know, Jonathan, from a building codes perspective is required parking is a land use matter. It's not a building code matter. And so that would be my assumption, is that we're looking at the required amount of parking for the structures.
Okay, that would be the way I would hope the draft rule kind of came out, just changing that if the you guys felt it met those requirements. And then Tony and I actually had some previous conversations on this subject matter, and it sounds like there's some other discussions on, do some of these need to go to accessible spots, and the Disability Council and stuff like that is still addressing that. So one consideration may be to, in your draft rule, potentially put in a C placeholder for, must be provided to accessible spots as required by the Oregon Structural Specialty Codes. That way, Tony, if he has to do an interpretation or later disability requirements change, you don't have to come back and update this portion of the rule.
Portland also supports that strongly. I think in California, they've actually, because code was so unclear, and then there have been lawsuits connected to it in California, we're trying to kind of ensure that we have ADA accessible parking and that it's clear in the code from the start.
Thank you.
Ingrid, are you, or Jonathan, are you all suggesting that there would be exclusively ADA only spots, or just that, the laws right now require that EV charging needs to be accessible, and there's, a variety of definitions of accessibility, but we expect, among other things, that the federal government will come out with a definition of accessibility for publicly funded charging stations through the federal infrastructure law. But for the most part, I think the way that most of the electric vehicle charging companies categorize their stations is they build them to certain accessibility standards, but they are not exclusively ADA only, handicapped only sites.
Yeah, exactly. They don't need to, and from our point of view, it doesn't need to be exclusive. They just need to be accessible. So big enough, the spots have to be big enough for, wheelchair vans or what have you. And then it needs to be accessible, like a ramp up to the actual charger so that it can be used by a person with disabilities.
And is that just a certain percentage of the parking structures, or is that what you're contemplating?
Yeah, we would want at least one to be accessible, depending on how big. I'm not sure ratio wise. We could look to California to kind of see, but at least one for each type of charger. So if there's going to be a fast charger or a level 2 charger, that there would be at least one accessible parking spot where you could access it, that are ADA accessible.
So yeah, Mary, the part of the question from our vantage point is just how the structural code's actually written. So in most cases, you end up with, as a loose example, it's not 100% this way because it is a table, but around 2% of the provided parking ends up needing to be accessible. So the question that I asked Tony prior to this meeting was, are we going to need to look at the way the code's written? Because it says when you have different parking facilities, well, now we are somewhat making two different facilities, one for EV stations and one for gasoline cars. Do we need to start looking at those elements? And he said that those are being discussed on the federal level and at this to determine how to handle that element, I guess. So for us, it would be one of those, if that's going to be coming, we want to just make sure it's clear to some people that may be coming in the future. We're not necessarily advocating for either particular way. If the DOJ says it's not required, it's not required. But as Ingrid said, we want to make sure that the spaces are available if it is required.
If I could chime in there, Andy and Jonathan. So a couple of things. My understanding is that accessible parking spaces in ORS 447233 were outside of the scope of the bill that we're discussing in the rulemaking. I don't think they were specifically included, but I think it's germane to the discussion, Jonathan, what you bring up here. A couple points of clarification. Historically, we've said if a EVCS is provided on an affected building site, its common use element, it absolutely must be served by an accessible route, must meet reach ranges, controls, all of those things. So just a point of clarification there. I think what we're looking at here, and Andy can jump in here if I'm wrong, but it's just primarily the infrastructure for having those EVCS potentially. Thank you.
Just point of clarification though, would it not, even if the law is only requiring that you create electrical capacity in order to serve electric vehicle charging stations or provide electric vehicle charging stations at 20% of the sites, if the sites, at least some of them, are deemed to be required, I believe ODOT views that sites, some percentage of sites need to be required. I think we have a draft roster of how many parking spaces, depending upon the total number of parking spaces available, need to be accessible. Since you were talking new construction, wouldn't that be likely to need to be known at the time of planning and development by the builders, that you would want them to know that they're going to have 20%, 1 or 2% of their 20%, at least one site accessible at the time of building, because that would be a lot easier for them to provide and develop and plan for that construction at the outset rather than come back and retrofit. So it seemed to me that the intent of the law would be to create the opportunity for EV charging parking spaces, and that would include most likely some percentage of accessible stations, parking slots.
Mary, this is Phil Barnhart. I was involved in the drafting of the predecessor bill to 2180. I don't claim authorship of this one, but I was involved in it, and you've added a wrinkle. I think that what the legislature intended was to make sure that when EV charging became popular, you were not going to have to go back and add service and add conduit in places where you were going to have to dig trenches and drill holes in walls and all of that kind of stuff after the fact. You've added another wrinkle, which I think, at least the spirit of the law, although it certainly doesn't say that, would apply as well. If you're going to require that an EV charger be accessible, then you probably need to plan the surface, the curbing, the spacing, and those kinds of things that I'm not familiar with from the beginning, as well as having the conduit in place and the service in place in the building. The statute certainly doesn't say that, but it makes sense given that the purpose of the statute was so you didn't have to retrofit the building or the parking lot in order to install an EV charger.
I can, for what it's worth, I can provide, they're very early and kind of old draft language that the Oregon Department of Transportation has for accessibility parameters for parking structures to you all, just so you'll be aware of what at least the Oregon Department of Transportation has been considering. But on May 13th, which sounds like it may be just right on the cusp of being too late, but on May 13th, we are expecting additional federal guidance for federally funded electric vehicle charging stations. And we expect that they will be addressing accessibility standards. These are for fast charging stations, so they may not directly apply, but it might be worthwhile to take those into consideration as well. But I'd be happy to share the ODOT draft language if that would be of interest.
Sure. Thank you.
It seems
May I raise
Go ahead, Phil.
may I raise a slightly different issue?
Of course.
One of the third bullet point, mixed-use buildings consisting of a privately owned commercial space and 5 or more dwelling units. I think that conforms to what the statute says. I think that also means that somebody who didn't want to do it could put 4 dwelling units on top of a mixed-use building and the requirement wouldn't apply to them. Whereas the guy next door who just has a commercial building would be required to comply. As I look at that, it's probably an error in the drafting of the statute because you're following the statutory language. But I'm wondering if you want to think about fixing that piece, even though the statute doesn't actually say it, so that it actually applies when a building has a mixed use, has a commercial space, and dwelling units, even though the statute doesn't say exactly that, because otherwise you simply avoid the requirement by putting in fewer than 5 dwelling units along with your commercial space. Whereas the building next door with the commercial space only is going to be required to meet this requirement.
Thanks, Phil. Mary?
Oh, if I could just unmute here. Okay. Now that Noelani's taught me how to raise my hand, I'm raising my hand. One of the things that I think needs to happen is to have a definition of what level 2 charging consists of at a minimum. And I would say that at a minimum, you would want to consider 40 amps and 6.6 kilowatts chargers. I think the standard today is probably closer to a 7.2 kilowatts, but you know, to create at least a minimum of 6.6 kilowatts and 40 amps. When we had conversations with DLCD about regulations along these lines for parking areas, and we had members of Portland General Electric on the call, they were very interested in having the rated 40 amps. The effective amperage is probably closer to 32, but the rating needs to be 40 amps and 6.6 kilowatts. So that was something that the utilities were supportive of for when we were talking with them about DLCD provisions. But you can't just say level 2 because there's a bazillion different kinds of level 2s, and they make them as low as 3.3 kilowatts, which really is not going to help a car that's over the next 10 years into the future that's new. It's really not sufficient.
Just to toss something else out there, curious if anyone has engaged with any of the auto manufacturers just to see what's in the pipeline, what's coming, just basically to touch on your point, Mary, as far as the size of the chargers themselves. And since it's kind of my thing, I would suggest referring back to the Oregon Electrical Specialty Code as far as a level 2 charging, what the current standard is, which may change in the future, and it could change with little notice. And it's possible that the legislation would then be tied to an older standard. Just so tossing that out there.
Thank you.
Philip, do you know what the current standard is in that code?
Well, there's a lot of different standards and requirements, but at least Article 625. And honestly, I would suggest, hey, Brian, if you're willing to speak up, he's actually one of my old instructors. He probably has a better idea of what's coming, not to mention a better idea of the installation. He's probably done an installation more recently than I have, actually.
That comment about the OESC, Oregon Electrical Specialty Code, is a good reference to include there. I thought the bill had that in there already, but definitely we'd probably want to tie it to Article 625 as well in the Oregon Electrical Specialty Code.
Yeah, again, this is Phil Barnhart. Again, the best approach probably is to require a conduit big enough to run the cable that you're going to want for the highest level of level 2 charging that you can anticipate. Because again, the point of this statute is to avoid having to dig up things in order to add electric vehicle chargers. I'm not sure how to do that, but I had the similar question to the one Mary had, which is, what does level 2 mean? She says 40 is probably adequate. I would argue for 100 because, I mean, I have 100 at my house, and that means I can charge 2 cars at 40 or 1 car at 72. I don't think that level 2 is likely to get a lot higher than 100. It might, but I doubt it. Certainly DC fast charging is definitely going to get bigger, higher, and faster than it is now.
So Phil, to touch on that, currently, and this is out of the, correct the cover here. This is out of the handbook for the 2020 NEC, which is adopted as a 2021 OESC, Oregon Electrical Specialty Code. Basically a side note underneath 65.42 for rating, basically says for level 2's primary method of EV charging at both private and public facilities, it requires special equipment and connection to an electric power supply dedicated to EV charging. The voltage of this connection is either 240 or 208 volt. The maximum load is 32 amperes or 7.7 kVA at 240 or 6.7 at 208, with a minimum circuit and overcurrent rating of 40 amperes, C625.41 for sizing of overcurrent protection.
And so that confirms with Mary's suggestion. It doesn't allow for the next generation of level 2 charging. Level 2 charging at home is not a problem because people charge overnight, but in places where people are going to want to get a significant charge in an hour or an hour and a half or 2 hours, bigger is better. I don't know how to manage that issue.
Thank you. Nathan?
Thank you. So the Oregon Electrical Specialty Code or the NEC, neither one of them defines level 2. The language that Philip just read from the handbook is that commentary in the handbook is not code language. It's not enforceable. It's just NFPA staff's additional language that they think is helpful, but it's important to remember that that's not enforceable language. If the NEC, the Oregon Electrical Specialty Code, could be amended to include a definition of level 2 charging, but it's not there now. And I guess I would just comment also that this is not the legislature. The legislature was the one that defined that these needed to be level 2 chargers, and we don't get to make the bill say what we would like it to have said. But I guess you could try to define level 2 to be a 100 amp charger like Phil suggests, but I don't think that's the commonly used definition of that term. I think the one Mary described is what most people would say is a level 2 charger, and what the handbook says as well. But to answer the question of the NEC or the OESC, there is no definition of level 2 currently in the electrical code.
Thanks, Nathan.
Yeah, I agree with everything that Nathan said, but I would suggest that the part of this thing is to future-proof new construction, and the way you do that is by maximizing rather than sticking with the current standard.
Thank you.
I think it's also important to remember that since they decided to throw this in 455, the intent of 455 is to be the minimum and maximum code that's enforceable by the state, not intended to be the ideal in all circumstances. It's what is the minimum for consistency around the state. And if industries already came up with a reasonable, using the NEC's handbooks, interpretation of what a level 2 is, if that's what industry has settled on currently, that should be the code minimum for today. As industry adjusts, future buildings will adjust for those. So I also think it's important that we don't try to upsize things, because all that does is add cost of construction and slowly, makes people not put in things either.
Thank you. Ingrid?
I was going to change the topic to another clarification of this language. Is it okay to move on to something else, or are we still?
Give just a sec. John, you have your hand up. Is that just from a minute ago still? Okay. If there is someone that has like something that's right on the tip of their tongue that they wanted to mention before we move to something else, we can always circle back in the future. Okay.
So I just like to say, after Ingrid shifts the subject, we've got, I believe we have ChargePoint and Tesla on the line, and I would like to hear what you think as a EVSE provider of charging infrastructure makes sense from a minimum standard for level 2 in future building construction of commercial, mixed use, and residential. But
okay.
I agree. Maybe it makes sense to do that now.
Okay. Noelani or Cesar?
Sure. Thank you, Mary. Well, everybody, good afternoon again. I think I want to phrase this kind of as looking specifically at the question you first posed, Andy, about, the rulemaking, does it fulfill the requirements? And I would say that at a minimum, it does. But I think referring to the spirit of the legislation, I think it really needs more, right? And I think one approach that we're consistent about when it comes to building codes is really trying to seek beyond just conduit, right? Where we want to make sure that when you're new construction, you have the capacity, like we're mentioning here, to be able to put the electricity in there to be able to meet the needs, but you want to go beyond conduit to actually electrical capacity. And it's not, at least the way I read it's not too clear if that's actually in here. So, in addition to just getting conduit that's empty, you want to have the capacity already in there, the wiring, right, for literally in there to the spaces. So I think that's something that we would push, as well as looking at EV ready as a standard. So even if you're looking at 20% of the parking spots, that they should be maybe pushing more towards EV ready, because that would meet something for level 2. So that's just some of the initial comments I have related to this matter. So I'll pause there and maybe turn it over to Nolani to see if she wants to add anything else or defer or anything like that, but I'll just pause.
Thanks, Cesar. And hi, everyone. Great conversation so far. We were obviously very excited to see this bill passed during the previous legislative session, especially that it now allows local jurisdictions, if they want to go further. We've worked closely with many states and localities as they think about their electric vehicle readiness as it relates to building codes. And so very excited to be here and involved in this advisory committee. I did add into the chat that we have seen other states and jurisdictions who do have electric vehicle ready building codes have defined level 2 charging with that 40 amp 208 240 volt component that was previously discussed. So we're supportive of that standard as sort of the baseline definition. Although what we have seen be discussed now and moving forward in codes is an allowance of energy management, especially when you think about multi-unit dwellings that are going beyond 20%. So 50%, 100% of those new building parking spots are capable of serving EVs, then allowing for some ability to do energy management to reduce the total power capacity needs for that parking garage. So that might be something to consider in this venue as well, at least providing the definitions for local jurisdictions to consider. Additionally, since I guess I have the mic right now, I concur with what Cesar said earlier. I do think that based on the requirements in the legislation, the draft rulemaking does respond adequately, but that there should be a venue, which I think this is a good venue to discuss both how to best provide guidance to local jurisdictions who want to adopt further and to look at other states and jurisdictions outside of Oregon who have looked at EV readiness and learn from them as well. And we do plan to provide some additional comments and links following this meeting that we hope will be helpful.
Could either of you just say what you mean by EV readiness in the context of this law and these provisions?
Yeah, it's a good question. And that's why I do think definitions will be important here. Some states have split up definitions for EV capable and EV readiness, and EV capable really meaning the focus on the power capacity for future parking spaces, and EV readiness meaning the power capacity, conduit, and even the either outlet receptacle or an EV charger at that parking stall. So EV readiness going beyond just the EV capable, is this parking spot or parking structure capable of serving 20% of the parking spaces with EV charging in the future? So those definitions are what we've seen come up in other states and jurisdictions. And we can provide all of that in comments as well. So Cesar, was that?
Yeah, I would say that's the same. That I was actually reading some of the chats. So I was going to put in at least initial definition that I've seen in another state, and that can at least help. But I think even just providing the difference between EV capable, be ready, helps folks understand what the implications are, right, with each one. But also, again, the spirit of the law of getting to more EV adoption and trying to also catch ahead of the time, trying to remove costs that come into place when you have to retrofit, as folks mentioned here. So, but I'll drop in one of the definitions right now.
I would also just ask Noelani, managed charging is certainly something that I think everyone is supportive of. I'm not sure that it is how stellar it is for just 20%. But it sounded to me like you were suggesting that in circumstances where you went beyond 20% to maybe even 50% of the parking spaces, that under those circumstances, managed charging made more sense. Can you address that any more detail?
Yeah, totally. we agree with exactly what you said, which is the use of energy management should be optional. So based on the choice of the building owner or operator, and that it really should be targeted and leveraged when you're reaching those higher percentages of EV readiness at that structure. Like, for example, a new multi-unit dwelling where they've decided that 100% or over 50% of the parking stalls will be EV ready in some function.
Yeah, I am very supportive of that. And that's actually what I wanted to bring up is we did an economic analysis based on the work that Portland is doing for our EV code project. And the economic analysis by Jerry Economics showed that as you scale up, as you're doing more and more EV ready parking spots, it gets more and more expensive. And so it makes a big difference whether or not you're using dedicated circuits versus shared circuits. And he suggested leaving flexibility for developers to be able to use shared circuits where possible. I don't see that the legislation actually addresses this issue. And maybe that's fine, because maybe by not addressing it, it gives flexibility. But I just want to clarify that that flexibility exists, because I think it's really important when we're talking about cost.
Well, I'll have to reread it again, but skimming through 625, which I don't hit on a lot in my day-to-day work. If I remember correctly, dedicated circuits are required. I'm not that familiar with charging stations, but again, I would suggest simply deferring to the professionals in the field and the OASC, as a lot of this is already laid out.
I guess something to add to that, Philip and Ingrid, looking through 625 as well, there is that call out for the electric vehicle branch circuits to be a dedicated circuit. But when we get back into 625.47, it does talk about a multiple feeder or branch circuit where equipment is identified for the application. More than one feeder or branch circuit shall be permitted to supply equipment. But that's sort of backwards from what we're talking about. We're actually talking about a feeder supplying more than one piece of equipment.
Yeah.
Here they're talking about having multiple feeders supply one piece of equipment, like some of the truck charging or some of the larger chargers that we've been seeing around town. So it is still just that branch circuit dedicated requirement, but it says it the one way, but it doesn't say it the other way. So,
well, this is Phil. I have not done the study that Ingrid has done, but I've done a lot of reading on this topic, and I understand that you can actually build a perfectly adequate system in a multi-car garage, for example, that would only be able to charge a fraction of the cars at the same time because of the computer system that actually controls the distribution of the power along the various conduits to the various charging stations. And that's in fairly common use in California, as I understand it now. And I think what we just heard from Brian and Philip is that approach is perhaps not legal in Oregon now. That obviously needs to be considered. There's no reason to put in enough service to charge every car that might ever plug in at the same time. And I'm sure the electricians are perfectly familiar with the reality. You need less capacity than 100% for a whole variety of things in addition to electric vehicle charging. But the gadgets that distribute power to cars based on the demand are already available. And as I understand it, they're in fairly common use in large structures in California now. So the question has to do with the amount of service that's needed, as I understand the problem.
If I could weigh in here, there's two elements to this bill. One is the raceway from the service location to the charging equipment, and the other is the size of the service. There's nothing currently in the OESC or the NEC that allows for any kind of diversity or load management equipment to reduce the size of feeders or service equipment to serve multiple EV charging outlets. But I don't know what's coming in the 23 code. I don't serve on that code panel, and I haven't seen what they've got coming. But if someone were to propose an installation like that, there could be a site-specific code interpretation to allow that. I think it certainly is the way of the future. But in terms of the conduit to the outlet locations themselves, unless the idea is, well, even if the idea is to share multiple outlets on one conduit, it doesn't really affect conduit size, or I should say, if the idea is to share multiple outlets on one set of conductors, that doesn't affect the conduit size or the number of conduits needed. Maybe you could reduce the number if you had 2 outlets on one set of conductors, but I don't think that's currently technically feasible or likely. So I guess my point is that this is an interesting discussion, and it will be addressed in code as the technology evolves and becomes adopted, but it's really not relevant to these rules, because in terms of the service size, there is no standard in the rule or the statute for how to size the service. That just evolves to the OESC. And as the OESC begins to add provisions for load sharing or load management and all these things, that will affect the design of the service. That's one of the reasons in the creation of this bill that we the electrical contractors, argued that we not be required to build the service at this time, because we expected, especially on these larger installations, that there would be some load management, and we would end up overbuilding services at this time, because in 5 years we could make it potentially much less. And there's a lot that has not yet been done about load diversity studies and load management studies for EV charging. I'm sure Tesla has developed a lot of data on this because of their charging stations, but it's not in the code yet. In fact, Oregon has a standard for load diversity on multiple charging stations that has not been adopted nationally, and is at the national level is not very well supported. But we have did some research and just concluded that there was some degree of diversity at least. But I think the whole problem with this is that it's evolving and changing and developing very quickly, and there's not enough information now to really know what we really need. So having space to do it and having conduit to the location for a level 2 charger is, I think, going to be more than adequate for what's coming in the future, because I think we're only going to see increased efficiency, not decreased efficiency.
I was going to say, Nathan, those are good comments, and the fact that don't mistake the fact that you need a conduit for each branch circuit. You don't need a conduit for each branch circuit. You need a pathway there, and if you have several branch circuits to run out there, you could actually just run one large conduit and get all of your individual branch circuits at that point. That way, it's just pulling wire, and you're not reinventing a conduit path or that type of thing. So,
the main thing, though, is that it's new construction, and you're doing this at the outset, and putting in the electrical at the same time you're sizing the electrical capacity for the rest of the building, at least for a minimum of 20% of parking spaces dedicated, I don't think is unrealistic for what the life of that building is going to need. I think it's a little bit not, at least the way I read the law. I wasn't part of the legislative discussions and not familiar with them all, but while there is that option to have just capacity, or just have space available, it would seem to me to be a real missed opportunity and a disservice to where electric vehicles are clearly heading right now, to not provide at least a minimum of 40 amps per EV, 20% EV parking space. I don't think you're going to go, I think the number of parking spaces over the life of those buildings is going to go higher than 20%. And, if a building exists for 15 years or so, then, probably you'll be up to 50% by the end of those 15 years of registered vehicles. And that it'd be foolish not to put in at least 40 amps for 20% of the parking spaces.
Well, something to keep in mind, if it's not being utilized, once you throw that wire in the ground, you throw the equipment on the side of the building. If it's not being utilized, I have yet to find an underground conduit, at least in Oregon, the areas that I've worked, that after a year or two isn't full of water. And again, if the wire's not being used, you're going to have oxidation, you're going to have corrosion. It's not doing the wire any favors if it's not being used. If the intent is to allow for future expansion, again, I believe the legislature's, the wording is from an electrician standpoint, is about on par with where we ended up with the PV for residential. Trying to plan for the future as much as possible. At the same time, again, I would strongly suggest that we defer to the contractors and professionals to basically tell us what we need, and also defer to the automotive manufacturers, just so we know what's coming down the line, so we don't throw tens of thousands or millions of dollars at electrical equipment that's going to sit out in a parking lot when cars are getting longer ranges, larger ranges. I just don't want people to waste material, time, not to mention the carbon footprint, just having all that equipment manufactured. That is a concern that generally I have as an electrician, not necessarily in my professional capacity.
I agree with that completely. And I'd like to add, speaking to Mary, that, you, with all due respect, you're entitled to your opinion about what owners ought to do as they plan in buildings. And if you're an owner of a building, you're planning one, and you think that it would be foolish to do anything other than build that service capacity at this time, then you certainly can't do that. But the law does not require you to do that. And I think that the law is well thought out, because as I said before, there are so many changes that could occur that could make what you do today not relevant. And we've provided for the capacity in space. You could build a service that size. You can provide a designated space for it. You can provide conduit for it. There's a lot of options on how to accomplish this. So, and I just don't know what, if I were planning a building today, I wouldn't know what to do other than put in the conduit, because right now, not many people are charging their vehicles at commercial buildings, and I don't know that that's going to be a big demand anyway. I've been driving an EV for 7 years, and I've parked next to EV outlets at commercial buildings many times, but I've never ever used one because it's just not necessary. Because I drive a car with pretty high range, and I charge it at home, or I charge it at one of the Tesla charging stations along the freeway. I'll stop talking.
Thanks, Nathan. Cesar?
Yeah, again, thank you for everyone for kind of providing points on this. I think, from our ChartPoint perspective, we work a lot with multifamily developers and apartment owners in different states, and we are seeing, with new construction specifically, right, an interest for them to provide EV charging as an amenity, and also to attract certain tenants. So they kind of see it as a hand-in-hand win-win in most urban locations, right? In different areas, everything kind of changes, but it's something that comes common. So I think when we think of this, it's more about the opportunities we see versus the burden that developers have to face. And again, we're seeing different use cases kind of take off. I think some of the lessons we learned, especially with the pandemic, was that before the pandemic, you had a higher charging rate in commercial, and then it completely flipped to residential, right? It's just overnight like that. So then that jammed up the needs for level 2 at residential. So I think that's just something to consider, right? That you need to have both great flexibility, but also you got to be future proofing ahead. And I think the folks that see that opportunity will attract tenants. In this case, I'm just talking about multifamily, but that they want to bring to their building, and kind of as, what else are you offering, right? You kind of have to up your game a little bit. So I think it goes hand in hand. And that's why I think with new construction looks like that way. If we were talking about retrofitting, whole different conversation, right? Because it's a whole different way if you're an operator and a building owner or manager to think about, I'm going to get on the hook for this gutter. So that's a bigger issue that we'll talk about, another bill that I read rulemaking, but I just wanted to add those points. So thank you.
Thank you.
Good points.
Yeah, I guess I just wanted to add that Portland is thinking about we're proposing to be more aggressive through our land use code to require 50% of all parking spots to be EV ready. And so I just want to be cognizant of that flexibility. And also what we need to be linking for our additional 30% back to your building code provisions for what that electrical looks like. So if you decide to, require dedicated circuits, we will also be required to require dedicated circuits for that extra percentage. And I just want to, allow flexibility so that, energy management services would allow more vehicles to be charged over time. We don't necessarily need that dedicated circuit capacity. So it would be great to allow for some flexibility there. And, keep in mind that local jurisdictions are all going to potentially have different requirements.
That's a really good point. Right now under the current code, if you're requiring 50% level 2, then someone's going to have to do a load calculation for a service for that load. I think it's sort of outside the scope of this rulemaking to address that. I think what I would say is that as part of this process, we should be asking building codes, kind of demanding that building codes have a parallel rulemaking process in the electrical code, which will be happening because in the NEC, the 2023 NEC is going to be adopted this year, and then we'll be doing code adoption for the next code cycle, and that would be the time to make the code amendments to address exactly what you're talking about, because it's really an electrical code issue. It's not a 455 thing; it's a 479 thing, and but you're exactly right. Under the current standard, if you're requiring 50%, you're going to have to provide capacity for a service space or room or service for 40 amps times 50% of the parking spaces, which is a lot and may turn out to be too much. So
yeah,
but it gets very technical, and it's really outside the scope of this kind of rulemaking. It belongs in the electrical code, and that's where you would have the allowances for sizing that service for load management.
Thank you.
I was going to ask Caesar if ChargePoint is already doing this load management stuff in other places, but he may have stepped away.
Yeah, here I actually did step away. Thanks for that question. We are seeing it in other states, right? We're getting into load management again. It's a technology, and I think a good thing we're seeing, whether it's building owners who want to manage the loads, right? Because in some cases, let's say at the end of the night, vehicles are returning, but not every vehicle needs the same amount of capacity to top off, so to speak. So having that active, kind of capacity is helpful. And also when we think about this, really applies to a lot more to fleets, that technology, that whether you're a city or other jurisdiction that has multiple EVs, just that this kind of technology to manage your load and kind of, either give a preference to, that's just one example. Again, another example, of course, in terms of the workplace that people are using is it allows folks just to manage the loads and also sometimes to be able to charge differently. But yeah, we are seeing it in different places, California and a couple other places, but that it's a good way to manage off of shared circuits and abilities to do that. So hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you.
So just a point of information, I was just looking at the 2023 electrical code as it currently stands, and it hasn't been finalized yet by the NEC. But there is a section even in the 2020 code for load management systems and allowing you to reduce the demand based on that. So it's already permitted in the code. What becomes challenging is when you're talking about the future and you're allowing someone to do something less than, I guess, what you might call the minimum standard. How do you assure that when they go and actually build this out, that they do that they do provide the energy management system that they designed around? So
FYI, Nathan, I'm Mayor to be aware of it. There is also SAM, or statewide alternate method 0901 for demand factors for charging stations, but it doesn't exactly get into load management. And as you mentioned before, the handbook, at least the comments, it's more of a guide. It's definitely not enforceable. There's some comments about load management in 625. Honestly, it's not as clear as I would hope it would be. And I'm hoping that the 2023 is a little more updated and has some better clarification, because at least as an electrical inspector, it doesn't give me a whole lot to go off of as far as technical means. It's a little too vague for my taste, but there it is.
I was really integrally involved in writing that statewide alternative method years ago with John Powell. That's how long ago it was. And I think that it's probably not going to continue to be supportable as these energy management systems come on board. And what's happening in this 2023 code is that Article 750 energy management systems is starting to be the place where all of these standards are located for energy management systems. And what the 2023 code does is it refers to Article 750 for what an EMS is and how it's supposed to work. So I think the code is trying to keep up with this change and transition to be a useful tool for these purposes.
Okay, that makes a lot more sense. Thanks, Nathan.
Yeah.
So I guess just to kind of try to make sense out of this conversation, as written in this proposed rulemaking, does it allow for flexibility for developers to be able to do load management? Or Nathan says it's kind of outside of this process. I'm just trying to understand kind of where that puts us.
I think that it does, because it just says that you have to provide capacity. It doesn't say how to do it. So you would naturally go to the OESC to determine how to do it. And that's what I've been talking about, is how the OESC is trying to keep up, or maybe needs to be pushed along to keep up with this. But I think the rule is sufficient, because all it's saying is you got to put in this electrical infrastructure. And the way our codes are structured, use structure in a different meaning, is if it's electrical, you go to the OESC to determine how to do it. What this rule tells you is you got to do this thing, but it doesn't tell you how to do it.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful.
Yeah.
And we can still define level 2 based on the suggestions here.
Yeah, again, I would put that in the electrical code, because there's a spot in 625 where it should be. It ought to be a proposal for the next cycle, actually, because
agreed.
It should be defined. But I think that there's a kind of a package of requests that go along with this rulemaking process to building codes to say there needs to be a parallel process in the OESC development to answer these questions that are coming up here. Because if we don't put the electrical rules in the OESC, then that creates a lot of confusion for the electrical construction industry. That's where electricians look for the rules.
And just to drive that home, as an inspector, what I'm doing here mostly is making sure that we have clear, bright lines that we're either going to cross or not going to cross. The worst thing we can do is create these gray sort of lines that might apply and might not apply. A clear white, a clear bright line to define whether you're inbounds and okay, or out of bounds and you need correction. That's that's an inspector's a dream to get a clear, bright line every time. Oftentimes we spend the majority of our time over these gray lines. So
it's tough.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Cesar?
Yeah, just had actually one question, actually a follow-up related to that Brian got me thinking, and also Nathan. I really appreciate your guys' expertise on the codes and other stuff, because that's what makes this kind of interesting, but also complicated, right? There's other codes in different sections that have to be tied. But one thing that I'm not too familiar in, that's why I'm posing this question, is for new construction, what is a trigger for new construction? I've seen that in some places where it's defined when you pull a building permit, and then there's a value amount, say $200,000 or more. Is that kind of how typically it's seen here in Oregon, or is that just really depends on jurisdictionally, or is it silent? But the trigger that says you're building X of new construction, now you must comply. So I hope if I don't know if anyone has an answer to that question, but I thought I'd raise that because it's not, that's not clearly in the legislation, but I know that's probably something of a practice in Oregon.
So I can chime in on that one. So in reality for us, new is new. So either you removed the existing building and decided to build back something, or it's vacant land to begin with and you're building on it. A remodel and addition wouldn't apply in this sense.
Thank you for clarifying.
I see Nolani's hand.
Hey, thanks. Yeah, I wanted to talk about the commercial building requirement here and flag something that we're starting to see in some states that already have commercial EV ready building requirements on the books, and many of them actually have EV charging station installation requirements. Typically, we've seen that be around 5%. And specifically wanted to flag that in some new commercial buildings, a fast charging solution might be more preferred for folks frequenting that building just based on how long they are typically there. So, for example, you could have a new commercial building like a grocery store where typically people are only parked there for under an hour at a time, and then they're on their way. And so level 2 charging, typically taking several hours to charge, might not be the best fit for those who are frequenting that location. And a fast charging option that you can charge your vehicle in under an hour makes more sense. And that definitely just depends on the building type and the typical dwell times and usage. So what we've seen in other jurisdictions is that there's compliance flexibility. So a commercial building can choose between providing EV readiness for level 2 or a mix of level 2 and fast charging, or just fast charging, depending on how that building is going to be used.
Thank you.
No, Alani, does that, do those examples also change then the percentage parking requirement? So this law requires 20% parking spaces be level 2 ready. Would it mean that if you were going to put in, just say, only DC fast charging, that 20% level 2 is equal to 5% parking spaces with a DC fast charger? So does it change the number of parking spaces as well?
Yes. So the ratio that we've seen is 5-to-1. So 5 level 2 EV SE installed would be equivalent to 1 DC fast charging for compliance. And so those ratios would apply depending on the size of the parking structure.
Yeah, and unfortunately, the current statute doesn't allow for that, but it probably should.
This is why we always oppose putting building codes in statute, Phil, as you well know. But
Yes.
Yes. So, and I don't know whether we have the flexibility in rule here to even say that if you install a fast charger, that complies as a level 2 charger. So in other words, can we say you have to install a level 2 or better at each of these locations? I don't think you're going to be able to comply with the statute and say that you could install fewer. That's a question for the lawyers. But we ought to put it in the rule if we can and create that flexibility to install a fast charger where you would otherwise be required to install a level 1 charger. And we would then need to define what a fast charger is. So.
And I also think it's really tied to the dwelling time that you're at a place, because in residential charging, a level 2 charger is actually preferable, cheaper, and better for the battery than it is, you know, if you are in a space in a commercial spot for a couple of hours. So I definitely don't think we want to get rid of the level 2 requirement for residential, but I agree that flexibility for the commercial and shorter dwelling time is good.
Yeah. Yeah, people might actually use them.
I think the statute does allow for the installation of DC fast charging because it says that can support at minimum electrical wiring for installation of level 2. So I think the rule could easily be written to allow for DC fast charging under the statute. It does not deal with the issue of how many spaces you might want to reduce it to if you were going to do DC fast charging instead.
But I would say the local government like Portland that wants to increase it to 50%, in that land use rule where you make that expansion, you could say to 50% unless some percentage of them are fast chargers, and then it's less.
So, yep, they could do that. Yep.
And we are not touching commercial. It's a 20% baseline for commercial. It's just mixed use and residential that we're allowing to go above. And so I don't know that it's as relevant.
Yeah, right.
Mixed use might be. You might still be able to apply some kind of flexibility there.
Potentially, yeah.
I think the challenge with this is that this rule does not require installation of the charger, and so you don't know what someone is going to do, what a building owner is going to do, but all kinds of flexibility is helpful, I think, in these circumstances, so that someone who owns a building can determine, even in a multifamily environment, they may prefer to have a single DC fast charger that they can valet, so, depending.
I guess the proposed rule already says the installation of a level 2 or better electric vehicle charging system. So maybe we did address that potential of a fast charger.
Yeah, and your point, Nathan, that Portland could adjust numbers based on their numbers above the statutory requirement if people use DC fast charging. I think that's very well taken.
Thanks.
Mary? You're on mute, Mary.
I was going to say, I think Noelani had her hand up first.
Oh,
let me
sorry,
defer to Noelani.
Oh, no, I apologize. I didn't lower my hand. Go ahead, Mary.
Okay. I was going to switch subjects to equity and just for a moment, if that's okay. Just tiny comment that we can expand on later or deal with the fiscal and economic impacts in whatever order you want. I just don't want before the end of our time for us to not deal with the fact that, the least costly charging is home charging. And so we want to make sure that we recognize that for multifamily dwellings, especially, and mixed use developments, that the level 2 charging is really the best way to provide the most economic opportunity for the users of electric vehicles. While that's not exactly racial equity, it is more trying to ensure that all Oregonians of all walks of life and income levels have the benefit of lower cost electricity.
Are they also going to have access to any grants as far as obtaining electric vehicles?
They do right now. And they have increased, we just increased the charge ahead rebate so that now it's up to $5,000 for the charge ahead rebate, which you can stack on the $2,500 onto the regular rebate. So that's $7,500. And we also, the charge ahead rebate through the Department of Environmental Quality also offers rebates for used electric vehicles, one of the few states that offers that. And many of the utilities offer incentives for putting in charging infrastructure. That's another thing. I don't know that the buildings could probably take advantage of that as well. That, but that would actually require putting in the charger.
Yeah, Mary, we have put a lot of thinking into that as well. And that's another reason why we're upping the percentage is for equity reasons, so that the early adopters or the first people to get into the apartment or multifamily dwelling. I mean, like, how do you split that up, right? Like, who gets access to the charging? And then as the market develops, how is that split out? And I think there's some equity issues. And it's one of the reasons why Vancouver, BC has gone to 100% requirement to try to do away with some of that, the like equity issues that we're going to see down the road.
Thank you. Really quickly, I'm wanting to push us to the next two issue items here, even though it's very possible there might be some folks that have more to say on this first one. If we get those next two, I'm happy to circle back. But before we do that, a little bit earlier, Ingrid, you had mentioned wanting to pivot to a different thing. Did we cover that during the course of the discussion? Or do you still want to, because I didn't want to skip over you and then not come
Yeah, back. Thank you. I had two other things. One is allowing or asking for signage requirements when chargers are installed. I'm not sure if this is the process for that, since it's only requiring EV ready, but it would be great to have some kind of direction from the state to require signage when there are chargers there. And maybe maybe that could be put into our local land use, but it would be great to have kind of a standard statewide. So I wanted to add that in. And then just to let you guys know that the Portland Land Use Code does not differentiate between private and public developers. So if we're requiring commercial development to have 20%, like PSU is a public entity, we don't differentiate. And so when you in the code say private commercial, it's an issue that is something that we need to figure out at a local jurisdiction, or I don't know if you can help with clarity in the state code, but that's it's kind of a disalignment that we need to work through. So just wanted to bring up those two issues. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay. For a moment, I'm going to pivot us to issue number 2 and then 3. And then if we still have some time there at the tail end and we want to circle back and do some more with 1, I'm happy to do that.
Andrew, can I comment on what Ingrid just said before you do that?
Sure.
So we don't lose this. I can't remember if we had this requirement in the pilot program for the EV readiness thing, but there should be in this rule a requirement that the location of the end of these raceways that are being installed be identified, and or if the EV equipment is installed, that signage would be added. But I've been involved in a few projects where we've put in the empty raceway, and we've always identified it so that whoever came down the road would be able to find that. And that seems like a really reasonable installation requirement. Now, maybe that belongs in the electrical code. I don't know, but it's a good point that she makes, both once the equipment's installed, but even when just the empty conduits are installed.
Yeah, and Nathan, that point was brought up during our stakeholder process for the conduit, identifying conduits and the end of the raceway as well as both. Yeah.
Yeah. That seems like an installation requirement, which would be more appropriately put in the OESC. So, but the signage for the sign once the equipment is installed, that's more of a building code issue. So that could go in this rule. Thanks, Andy.
Oh, thank you. Okay, I'm going to move on to issue 2. What are the potential fiscal and economic impacts of the proposed rules? With any rulemaking, the division is required to make particular note of potential fiscal and economic impact that might result from the new rules. The division would welcome any input from the committee on the nature and extent of any fiscal or economic impact that may be caused by this rule. Some examples of potential fiscal or economic impact would be additional costs or requirements on local municipalities, particular types of businesses. Will the new rule require additional training to implement, comply with, or enforce? Will the new rule make particular actions or products more expensive or less expensive? These are all just examples. Anything you can think of that might be a potential fiscal or economic impact of the rule would be worth mentioning. If you have any thoughts, please feel free to let them fly.
Well, currently, I know PVC is in somewhat short supply. That would be an immediate concern I'd have. A little longer term, electrical equipment is in short supply, depending on the size of the equipment, size of the service, the fault current rating. Some projects, at least there's a couple of multifamily, basically big apartment complexes in town here in Albany. They're, one of them was like 4 months out on their gear. They were still waiting on calculations from Pacific Power because they were unable to properly size their equipment. There was another project, similar multifamily apartments. I think they were 6 months out, and they're getting, it's really not any abnormal equipment. It's 1,000 amp, 1,200 amp rated gear, but everything's been in short supply. So trying to find just the materials to physically put this in, I am a little concerned that it would hold up projects. Not that, leaving an open trench is difficult, but it's not safe, and it's unlikely you're going to have general contractors wanting to do it long term. Hopefully a lot of these supply chain issues will get resolved, but at least in the immediate future, especially if this goes in July, for site work, which usually you want to have done before you're starting on the building, it could actually have a compounding impact on schedules, costs, timelines, all those things. And I'm sure there's a lot of other people that have way more knowledge and are already doing numbers on projects themselves that might be able to chime in.
Thank you. Jonathan?
Said obviously there's going to be a large economic impact to development itself just for the implementation, especially if they're not actually planning to implement EV charging stations initially. But the jurisdictions are also going to have an amount of expenses because the way our current fee structures are set up by rule, really we just charge by the branch circuit. If they're choosing not to add the wiring yet, we're kind of in a conundrum of how do we charge for the required inspections that we'll have for the conduits and stuff, because they're not really branch circuits yet, you know what I mean? So there's potential impacts on, like in our case, I'll have to have Philip go out there at least once, if not multiple times, to look at conduit where our current fee structure doesn't have that. So the jurisdictions are going to end up having costs involved in that will likely have to be addressed in future fee updates and stuff like that.
Thank you. Any additional thoughts on fiscal and economic impact?
Well, I'm not sure, the requirement that rules be considered for their physical and economic impact. The fiscal and economic impact was caused by the legislature, not by the rulemaking. So there's no additional impact beyond what the legislature already did. I don't know how that fits into the requirement, but it's going to add a lot of costs for the jurisdictions. There's going to be additional plan review. There's inspections that they're going to have to figure out how to charge for. And if they figure out how to charge twice for a branch circuit, which is what Jonathan was saying they need to do, then that's going to be an additional cost for the property owners. And then, of course, the conduit, the trenching, the equipment, the service equipment, or even just the space for the service equipment. All of that is not insignificant. So.
Like I said, we did an economic analysis, like Jerry Economics, so I can pass that along as well.
Great, thank you.
I would just like to speak up for the fact that there are potential economic benefits for the developments as well, and for the users and the people who live in those buildings, but also for the building owners who can attract a different type of clientele because they have electric vehicle charging, both commercial, multi-unit, and mixed use. So let's not forget that there are benefits that go along with this as well.
Yeah, I want to add to that with the gas prices increasing and the ability to be able to have a less volatile fuel source for tenants. That's definitely an economic benefit.
So just for clarity, so I looked up the charger head rebate. Am I understanding it right that it's a rebate? So once you purchase an electric vehicle, they reimburse you, or they're actually floating you a loan?
Isn't it cash on the hood? It's a rebate. Okay.
I'm not sure.
It can be here. I'm sorry. So they have over 100 dealers, I believe, that have signed up for cash on the hood right now. The charge ahead rebate, because it's income qualified, that portion of the rebate can't be cash on the hood just yet, but DEQ is working on getting people, developing a system whereby you will be able to be pre-qualified for the charge ahead rebate. So when you go in and buy a vehicle or lease a vehicle, it comes right off the top. So while it's not a full, the standard rebate is a rebate that is easily applied, and many dealers apply that right now. But the charge ahead rebate, because it's income qualified, requires proof. But again, as I said, DEQ is working on a system to enable that to be taken at point of purchase.
Okay, but it's still essentially dependent upon the buyer to have quite a bit of additional cash on hand in order to purchase a used or new vehicle, which economically speaking is not necessarily a lot of people, at least a lot of the people that I see on a fairly day-to-day basis.
But that's why they're working on getting it pre-qualified, so it'll be cash on the hood. So it will be there, it just isn't there just yet.
And it applies to used vehicles as well. So it depends on what kind of, if you're using an old gas vehicle that requires maintenance, it could actually be way cheaper to get a used vehicle that doesn't require maintenance and has a less volatile fuel costs.
Yeah, one of the things to consider when you're talking about fiscal and economic impacts, if you are building a new multi-unit dwelling, for example, and you have facilities for charging readily either installed or readily installable at low cost, you're going to have a significant advantage as the number of electric vehicles in use increases. And the statistics about that issue are that they're increasing like crazy right now. Tesla's orders, for example, doubled a couple of days after gasoline went to $4. It's going to be a while, a few years before there's enough electric vehicles being manufactured to meet the demand. But that demand is going to be huge. So the guy who owns a new building and has installed the systems that are expensive to retrofit and can install electric vehicle chargers will have a significant advantage over older buildings that are going to have to retrofit expensively because of the need to add systems in hardened structures that are already in place. And so, I mean, the economic impact issues, the fiscal impacts are very complicated. Costs a little more upfront, but the guy with the new building might actually get a huge advantage from that as compared with somebody whose building was built in 2019 and has to add systems that are very expensive to add later.
Well, and again, fortunately, the scope of this is only for new commercials, so there's no requirement for retrofitting. If you want to talk about drawing in new customers, that's one thing, but
right.
As far as the economic, looking at it from that perspective, as far as the folks that are buying electric vehicles, currently they're all new for the most part. A lot of the folks that I still see that are driving older vehicles, they've had them for a while. Not to mention the used car market is a little crazy right now. Hopefully that settles down. I'm concerned that this focuses a little too much on folks that can't afford brand new vehicles or almost new vehicles. Granted, a couple of years it'll be a different picture, but it's a very focused bit of legislation. I'm just curious about the rest of the state. That's all.
Yeah, Philip, you're absolutely correct, and I obviously misspoke. What I'm talking about are the trends that are changing very, very rapidly. And you're absolutely right that this rule doesn't apply to existing buildings, but landlords are going to discover that at least some of them will figure out that they need to add electric vehicle charging in order to attract the tenants they want. And I obviously didn't say that very well, but you're absolutely correct in what you said.
No, I understand. I know what you meant. It was fairly clear. Thank you.
I would just add lobbying for fourth on this in favor of this bill and working with Representative Wilde and others to develop the legislation. A big part of the legislative intent was specifically to minimize the cost of putting in charging capacity by requiring installation of conduit at the time of construction, acknowledging that would have some marginal increased cost, but that I believe the statistics that we used, and I know we have people who are more experienced in this than I am, but that it was about a fifth or a sixth as expensive to install the conduit at time of construction than trying to do it after the fact. And that particularly as electric vehicles are owned by a wider swath of the population, including a lot of people in multifamily housing, that legislators wanted to make sure that those people had access to charging as well and minimize costs for building owners of having to try and go back and install that conduit after the fact. So I think while the cost isn't zero, I think the legislative intent was to minimize long-term costs of building out this infrastructure by preparing our buildings now.
Thank you. Okay, unless there's another burning comment, I want to move to the last issue, and then if we get through with that one by time, we can circle back, and if there's anything else that folks want to discuss, but I do want to make sure to get through our agenda here. So last but not least, what are the potential impacts on racial equity in the state? With any rulemaking, the division is required to make particular note of any potential impact on racial equity in the state that might result from the new rules. The division would welcome any input from the committee on the nature and extent of any impact this rule may have on racial equity in Oregon.
So looking at we did a stakeholder process on focusing on how to increase EV charging access to renters specifically. And there's a lot of barriers to, think about being a tenant and trying to figure out how to get charging infrastructure installed in your building when you don't own it, you don't manage it, you don't have the ability to be able to kind of navigate through some of these complicated layers. And so I think there's real, and we know that there's a disproportionate amount of BIPOC folks who are low income and often live in multifamily housing. And I really think that this bill could really open up the amount of charging in multifamily housing. So there's definitely, it's decreasing a bunch of complicated layers and hoops that renters would need to jump through to be able to access EV charging. And folks in condos have a hard time trying to figure out how to put this in. And oftentimes they have more control over ownership and more disposable income to access.
I see two hands and I did not catch which order they were in. So I'm just going to go V-Paker first, then Cesar.
Sandy, yeah, a couple things. So for the rules, thinking about racial equity, since it's very tied with like economic equity as well. I was thinking about any rent increases that might be that renters might be subject to as charging gets installed. So I don't know what's under the jurisdiction of BCD, but thinking about what kind of like renter protections come with charging installation, so people aren't priced out of places that they're renting. And also thinking about, again, depending on BCD's jurisdiction or how BCD can work with other agencies, but thinking about rules on how much public charging is being costs for people, knowing that there will be like, a lot of these will be like private companies setting up these charging stations, but thinking about like how we can have rules for maybe cost parity, knowing that people who rely on public charging pay a lot more for charging their vehicles than people who have access to garages. So maybe even working with like utility companies to have rates for people who fall into low income utility rates, and things like that. But just some thoughts there.
Thank you. Cesar?
All right, thanks again. And I just want to echo other commenters' comments related to this topic. I think, what I could say is, in other places we've seen that this in legislation does significantly help, and it's a step in the right direction. We've seen other legislation out there regarding right to charge bills in different states that do give the right of a tenant to pursue the opportunity to charge and to install equipment at their station. But we do see that, generally speaking, that one divide that happens in this case is really with the disparity with multifamily, right, where disadvantaged communities do face more of a burden, and in particular the difference between new construction and existing, right. And I think that's where the work continues, because I think the older buildings are typically the ones that you see the disparities, and those are the ones that we've seen across the board in other places still have a challenge to install EV charging stations in the older buildings. So that's just something to note that, I think we're talking here about new construction, but that for other discussions, that's something we'll have to continue to pursue if we want to avoid to create a further divide as we move forward in this space. So just wanted to add that to the note.
Thank you. Any additional thoughts on issue 3 here? Mary.
Yeah, I'll just reiterate what I said before, which is that it fundamentally increases access to charging at the lowest possible cost to the user. So that at least in the multifamily arena and in the mixed use arena, The commercial arena can be, especially if there's some flexibility on using DC fast charging, it may not be the cheapest, but and people want, studies show that that's what they want the most. They want to be able to charge at home. If they are able to park in a garage or in a parking facility associated with a building, that's, at home is number one, and number two is at work. So to the extent that we can provide level two, to the extent that you need to talk about the equity aspects of this, that it certainly creates more and more opportunity for all Oregonians to have greater access to the opportunity for EV charging.
Thank you. Ingrid.
Yeah, and I just add that as car manufacturers start phasing out gas vehicles and state and other government jurisdictions start requiring the sale of zero emission vehicles by X date, California 2035. Without access to EV charging infrastructure, we'll start seeing a divide, like an access divide to who's able to fuel their vehicles and who isn't. And I fear that it'll be similar to kind of like the digital divide, right? Now it's really important that we have broadband and Wi-Fi to be able to have access to internet so that we can have economic opportunity and do our jobs from home. It'll be a similar situation in terms of ability to access the transportation options that folks need if we don't figure out a way to allow accessible and affordable charging to everyone. So I definitely feel like this is a step in the right direction.
Thank you. Anyone else have anything else on issue 3 specifically here? Okay. Anybody have anything that I either on issue 1, I cut you off too early when we transitioned to issues 2 and 3, or something that popped into your brain since then that you want to mention, or something that we didn't even cover in one of our conversations so far that you want to bring up now? Now is the time. And V, I got you up first.
Thank you. And sorry if I missed this earlier. I think someone in the chat had talked about what about new construction that doesn't have parking spaces? And I was wondering if there is anything kind of in the codes on like street parking, just knowing like PGE has a program of like using like utility poles to have charging for electric vehicles. So I didn't know if that like falls in the rules. And again, sorry if I missed that earlier.
You're fine. And Tony could jump in if I'm way off base here, but I think I'm on fairly good ground in terms of the building code really covering the building, and the parking happens as sort of like as it is accessory to the building. But once you get out to street parking, that kind of goes outside of our purview.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Andy. You nailed it. So we're talking about on the site as far as application of the state building code. As soon as we get into the public right of way, there is some availability for local municipalities to consider local ordinances, but the state building code does not apply in the public right of way.
We can talk offline, but City of Portland has some projects in the works.
All right. Anybody else feel passed over, missed out, or in any way wanting to articulate a thought at this point? Just jump on in, Mary.
I have a question.
Okay.
Would commercial new construction include just a new parking facility? Would that be considered a commercial new construction?
Can you imagine Tony Rocco's ears just itching right now as you're asking that question, because he knew I was going to defer to him?
You know, and I say this because several of us spent a lot of time working with Department of Land and Conservation Development on EV ready parking ordinances, only to have the Department of Justice say that that was not in their purview, at least not in the way that we were, the way that they were being proposed. And I'm just wondering, well, but so if you've got a parking lot out there, somebody builds a parking lot or somebody's got a parking structure, does that count as new construction, and would this apply?
It's a great question. So I can just speak from the state building codes perspective. Parking garage, yes. Blank, lot with a parking lot, no. If there's no building associated with it, then there's no regulation from the state building code side. But yes, if you had a parking garage, absolutely. It's a governed structure under Chapter 4 of the OSSC.
Hey, Tony, the current ORS does apply to any parking facility with over 50 spots needs to install 5% EV ready. So that I would think I don't know whether or not that's going to become obsolete when this goes into effect, but I think that did cover parking, like surface parking lots that aren't attached to buildings. It was kind of an obsolete, it didn't make any difference in Portland because we really aren't building parking structures with over 50 spots generally. Like that's not really happening.
Sure.
And if it's not happening in Portland, I don't know where it would be happening, but that I think that's the only piece that might have applied to surface parking.
Yeah, it's a great note. And we can take a closer look at that. My understanding is it would be, the parking lot that is serving a commercial building, right? That's where we would have purview as far as application of the state building code. But great note. I think we could take a closer look at that.
And I have one other question in terms of this was triggered by Ingrid's comment about Portland State University. So if it's supposed to be private commercial, I thought Portland State is a private university, so I would think that would apply. But does this mean that it doesn't apply to new hospital constructions and the parking lots associated with that if it's a nonprofit? Does it? What is excluded? If it's a nonprofit, is it excluded? If it's government,
a nonprofit would still be privately owned. It'd just be privately owned by that nonprofit. I'm assuming that I believe that the private ownership was specifically to bifurcate between private ownership and public ownership. So like, as you were mentioning, I think you were talking about University of Portland, which is private, and PSU.
Yeah, PSU is a state owned.
Yeah, Portland State. That makes sense. So it's publicly owned, but just like Oregon, University of Oregon, it's like only 5% of the funding comes from the state. So most of it's private anyway. But
OHSU is public.
So OHSU would not apply to OHSU.
We don't differentiate in the city, so I think our code would apply, but that's where we have to figure it out.
I have a question for Tony. Tony, if you built, in the unlikely event that some local government would allow someone to build a parking lot on a vacant lot with no other structure associated with it, and you wanted to put in lights or a kiosk to measure, for managing the fares and whatnot, the electrical code would apply to that. And so why would you say that structure, that parking lot is not completely exempt from the building code?
Yeah, that's a great point of clarification there, Nathan. I meant the structure, like the building code, my side, not the electrical safety law. So absolutely, 479 reaches much further than some of the carve outs we have on the state building code side, or on the building code side, excuse me.
So for the purposes of this rule, it's not really tied to the structural code. I mean, it's not clear really, or is it? I would have answered that question differently from the way you did. So I maybe want to dig a little deeper.
Sure. And what I'm looking at is under 3A there, the application, commercial buildings under private ownership, multifamily residential buildings with 5 or more. I was just going down that list there.
If there's no building, then it's not, doesn't apply. Yeah.
Right. And even in the 2, it says parking area of the building. Since there's not a building, there's no parking area of the building.
So I guess, Mary, it doesn't apply to just parking lots. The parking structures it would apply to.
Not that anybody would be out there more interested in putting a parking lot in versus a parking structure, but it does seem funny that it's not governed by anybody.
Yeah.
Because I don't think DLCD thinks they have authority or jurisdiction over a freestanding parking structure that's built either, at least according to the Department of Justice, at least according to my understanding.
Parking structure is a different thing than a parking lot.
But yeah, a parking lot.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm sure there isn't a city on this call that will allow someone to just build a parking lot anymore anyway. So.
I guess I have one just for clarification. I know the bill only says garages and parking areas, but should the rule include carports, since we do get carports at multifamily and stuff like that, just to clarify, it's all the parking areas?
Hey, Jonathan, your mute's still on.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So one question, I guess, is I know the bill says garages and parking areas of the building, but should the rule be clarified to include carports, so that way it's clear we mean all parking areas of the building that's servicing the building?
Just to push back a little bit on that, Jonathan, do you not think that a carport would be covered under the sort of broader term of parking area?
I think it would, but we get to argue a lot of things with a lot of customers, and they'll look at that and say, well, it says the garage or the parking area. Since it's inside a structure and they specifically said garage, they didn't intend it to be the carport.
I'll make a note to look at that. Thank you.
Make it a little easier for Jonathan. I think he's right on.
All right. Anything else? It's 3:30 now, but if someone has more they want to say, I'm here for you.
I mean, to Mary's point, I think it would be good to include surface parking, but is what you're saying that it's outside of DCD's area of influence?
Yeah, there isn't really that regulated building attached. It's sort of outside of our book of business. Okay, if I'm talking over someone and you have something you want to add, just interrupt me. But I don't see anybody else with a hand raised or chomping at the bit to mention something. But I want to reiterate again, if you have something that you think of 5 minutes after we hang up or a few days from now, just send it in that same email, that rules coordinator email for BCD that you use to RSVP here, and just get it to us by end of day Friday if you can. Okay. Thank you, everyone, so much. I think it's been a really good discussion. I really appreciate everybody taking the time to show up and talk over all these things with me, and teach me a thing or two, and make me ask Tony all the important questions.
Thank you for the process.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Andy.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.